Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Mind of Cy Marie. I'm your host, Cy Marie, and it is Saturday, August the 22nd, 2026. Today, we need to dismantle a massive, persistent cultural delusion. If you ask the average person on the street what Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre is about, 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you, oh, it's that classic passionate Victorian romance, the quiet, fierce governess who falls in love with her brooding boss, Mr. Rochester. You see it on paperback covers everywhere, sweeping, misty English landscapes, two lovers staring intensely into each other's eyes. It gets tossed onto Valentine's Day reading lists right next to Pride and Prejudice, which is wild to me. Because if you actually sit down and read Jane Eyre without those nostalgic, romanticized glasses on, it is not a sweet romance at all. It's a deeply unsettling Gothic horror story driven by systemic entrapment, psychological manipulation, and literal physical confinement. That's not romantic, my friends. So, look at what actually happens to Jane. She's an orphan child abused by her family, locked in the Red Room where her uncle died, sent to a starvation school where her best friend dies of typhus, and then lands a job at Thornfield Hall, where her brooding romantic lead, Edward Rochester, is a gaslighting millionaire who keeps his first wife locked in the attic, lies to Jane about her very existence, tries to manipulate Jane into a bigamous marriage, and then offers to turn her into his kept mistress on a French villa when he gets caught. Rochester literally keeps Jane in the dark while violent, terrifying incidents happen around the house, bed sheets set on fire, guests getting stabbed in the dead of the night, demonic laughter echoing through the halls. It's a psychological thriller. In fact, it's a horror. The core theme isn't love conquers all, it's Jane's relentless struggle to preserve her own autonomy and self worth against men who want to consume her. To truly understand why Jane Eyre is so dark and deeply problematic, we have to talk about the presence haunting Thornfield Hall, Bertha Mason, the mad woman in the attic. That phrasing became a famous piece of literary criticism by Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar, but in Bronte's actual text, Bertha is treated less like a human being and more like a monstrous narrative obstacle. When Jane finally sees Bertha in chapter 26, Bronte describes her locked behind a hidden door on the third floor, guarded by the drunk servant Grace Poole. She's written as snarling, savage creature, crawling on all fours, making animalistic noises. And why is she there? In Rochester's version of the story, which the novel asks us to swallow, he was tricked by his father and brother into marrying Bertha in Jamaica for her 30,000 pound fortune. He claims her family hid her madness and her wild, debauched nature from him. Notice how Bronte codes that madness. Bertha is a Creole woman from the West Indies. In Victorian terms, she is a white woman born in the colonies, though Bronte heavily uses the racialized tropes of the era to link her fiery temperament, such as saying she has a dark face and thick lips, to non-European identity. Bronte uses Jamaica as this exotic, corrupting space where Rochester loses his innocence, contracts to a bad lineage, and brings the literal baggage of British imperialism back home to hide it in his English country house. Bertha exists in Jane Eyre purely to serve as a foil to Jane. Jane is a small, pale, chaste, restrained English womanhood. Bertha is a large, dark, passionate, uncontrolled foreign chaos. And for Jane and Rochester to get their happy ending, Bertha literally has to burn down the house and die by jumping off the roof. Her destruction cleanses the narrative so the white English couple can build a quiet life together. It's honestly deeply uncomfortable when you zoom out and you think about all of those things. For over a century, that was Bertha's only story. She was just the monster in the attic until 1966, when the Dominican English author Rhys published her masterpiece prequel, Wide Sargasso Sea. Rhys read Jane Eyre and was haunted by Bertha. She famously said that Bronte's depiction of a West Indian heiress was a horrific caricature, and she wanted to give that madwoman a voice, a real name, and a history. In Wide Sargasso Sea, Rhys renames her Antoinette Cosway. The novel is set in Jamaica and Dominica, right after the Emancipation Act of 1833. Antoinette is a white Creole, the daughter of former slave owners. She belongs nowhere. The newly freed black population despises her family for their history of oppression, while the incoming English colonists look down on them as racially impure and degenerate. Enter a young, bitter second son from England who is never explicitly named in Rhys's book, but is undeniably Rochester. He marries Antoinette purely for her family's money. Rhys brilliantly flips the perspective. You see Rochester arrive in the lush, overwhelming tropical landscape of the Caribbean. He feels so out of control, threatened by the climate, the culture, and Antoinette's sensuality. So what does he do? He destroys her identity. He hates that he can't control her, so he starts calling her Bertha, literally stripping away her real name to remold her into something he can categorize. He gaslights her, alienates her from her land, cheats on her in her own house, and drives her into a mental breakdown. It's a terrifying portrait of imperialist abuse and misogyny, or, even deeper, the fact that Rochester doesn't just lock up a woman who was born mad. He is the one who drives her to madness through isolation and psychological warfare, then drags her back to the cold gray England to lock her away in a room without windows. When Antoinette sets fire to Thornfield at the end, it's no longer a monstrous act of violence. It's an act of tragic liberation, an attempt to reconnect with the red fiery warmth of her Caribbean home. Which brings us to 1993, when director John Dugan adapted Wide Sargasso Sea into film. This film is so fascinating from a casting perspective because Antoinette slash Bertha is played by actor Karina Lombard, which I just have to point out, I think that Zendaya looks quite a bit like Karina Lombard. I just found the way that these two women look uncanny, and many of you probably know Karina Lombard from another massive 90s film, Edward Zwick's 1994 epic Legends of the Fall, where she played Isabel Decker, or Isabel II, Brad Pitt's eventual wife and mother of his child in the movie. In Legends of the Fall, her playing Isabel II, she is a character of mixed Cree and Euro-American descent living on a Montana frontier. Lombard herself is mixed Lakota, Swiss, and Russian, and she was raised across Europe and North America. So, casting a BIPOC woman like Lombard as Antoinette in Wide Sargasso Sea explicitly pulls out what was the subtext in Rhys's novel and heavily suppressed in Bronte's original text. By having Lombard play Antoinette, the film physically underlines the racial and colonial dynamics that were at play. When Rochester looks at her on screen, you see his simultaneous racialized exoticization and his deep-seated Victorian terror of non-white or non-European bloodlines. Lombard brings this raw, vulnerable elegance to the role. She plays Antoinette not as a doomed Gothic victim from the start, but as a young woman deeply connected to her island, reaching for love and intimacy, who gets systematically dismantled by a man who fears everything that she represents. And connecting that back to her role as Isabel II in Legends of the Fall in both films, Lombard plays women existing on the fringe of dominant white patriarchal empires. Whether it's the British colonial machine in the West Indies or the expansionist American West, in both stories, her characters carry the heavy thematic weight of how those empires attempt to tame, claim, and discard women of color. So when we trace this line from Charlotte Bronte in 1847 to Jean Rhys in 1966 to Karina Lombard on screen in 1993, we see this massive, vital cultural evolution. Jane Eyre remains a powerful piece of literature. Jane's voice and her fight for integrity were groundbreaking for Victorian women, but calling it a sweet romance ignores the literal monster in the closet. It ignores the fact that Rochester's grand romance is built on the violent erasure and imprisonment of another woman. Wide Sargasso Sea reminds us that every Gothic mystery has a victim whose story was silenced, so the main characters could have their happily ever after. Bertha wasn't a nameless demon in the rafters. She was Antoinette Cosway. And seeing that history brought to life through performers like Karina Lombard forces us to confront those themes head on. So the next time someone tells you Jane Eyre is their favorite cozy love story, ask them how they feel about the third floor at Thornfield Hall. I also want to remind you that it's important to think about Wuthering Heights as we talk about this, because Emily Bronte, who is Charlotte's sister, wrote Wuthering Heights. And when we look at Heathcliff, there are very similar themes here to Bertha / Antoinette, in that these are people of color in these English families that are abusive, gaslighting, trying to control the narrative, and it just is a continual kind of highlight to how, these patriarchal imperialistic mentalities continue to cause generational traumas and harms. And I think that we really need to ensure that with both of these stories, we don't just look at them as these passionate, obsessive, breathtaking romances, but truly look at all of the variables, because in a lot of ways they are tragedies and they're haunting and they're sad. And so the next time, again, someone tries to tell you Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights are one of their favorite love stories and is quoting quotes from them as a way to decree their love, ask them if they actually understand the depths of having another person imprisoned against their will and hidden away, how much trauma and pain that would leave, and how haunting the situation might produce from that. So that's all for today's episode of The Mind of Cy Marie. I truly hope you enjoyed this story, and I hope that you will look at Rochester differently now that you've learned a little bit more about Bertha / Antoinette's story. If you've seen the movie, I'd love to hear about it. If not, I definitely recommend Wide Sargasso Sea with Karina Lombard and the titular role of Antoinette. And as always, remember, the mind is the most important story that we'll ever tell. Thank you for listening, as always, to The Mind of Cy Marie.